Welcome everyone. This is a 1-hour webinar entitled V-Ray Advanced. My name is Brian Smith from 3DATS and the CGschool. This is a 1-hour presentation designed to be a small sampling of a larger 18-hour class offered at the CGschool. If you would like to learn more information about the classes offered at the CGschool, please visit the website you see on your screen there. This is an advanced class, as it says, and because it's an advanced class, the information that I will be presenting is going to be pretty complex, and if you're a beginner or a new user to V-Ray, you will probably be lost in a lot of the areas. I'm going to be throwing out a lot of information very fast, and the information is not going to be presented in the normal fashion it is presented in a class. This is a 1-hour class, and it's not much time to cover very many subjects, but I'm going to try to cover as many subjects as I can and throw as much information out as possible. And because it's an advanced level class, it is conducive to that type of environment, and hopefully everybody can learn something from this. One quick note about the machine that I'll be working on. This is a Go Box from Box Computers. It is a brand new machine, new out of the factory. It's a 6-core mobile workstation. It's very new. It was just developed in the last month. It has 6 physical cores, 12 virtual cores when combined with hyper-threading. It's an Intel i7-980 with 12 gigabytes of RAM. So all in all, it's a pretty fast machine, and it's very great for being on the road, which is where I am right now. The other reason this class is particularly the reason why this class is pretty unique for me is because I'm doing this live from the Chaos headquarters in Sofia, Bulgaria. So long way from home, having a great time here. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. One more quick note about the scenes that I'll be presenting in this webinar. This is a Go Box, and it is very fast, and you're going to see 12 different processors running behind the scenes and 12 buckets rendering, but still, when you're given a live class and you only have 1 hour to work with, it doesn't leave much time for dead air, and I don't like wasting your time. So I'm going to keep the scenes fairly small, and in some cases do render regions, but for the most part these scenes are pretty streamlined and easy to work with. Well, let's real quick look at the agenda for this particular class. And here is the agenda. We're going to be talking about image sampling first, by far the most important area of V-Ray. Then we're going to move quickly into GI engines and talk for about 10 minutes on various GI engines. And again, this is advanced. If you're new, you're probably going to be lost in this particular area, but if you are an advanced user, intermediate level user that's been working with V-Ray for some time, you certainly have some things that you'll probably be able to pick up here. Next, we're going to move into the DMC sampler, progressive path tracing. The raycaster parameters that you find in the system rollout will cover some of the important features there. V-Ray frame buffer, you might not realize some of the new things that's in that V-Ray frame buffer. We're going to look at that. Render elements, a couple new features inside the render elements area. Raw image files and AA filters, anti-aliasing filters. Now this is not a comprehensive at all view of V-Ray. It is just a sampling. It is just several different features to give a pretty good variety of the features in V-Ray and some of the things you can learn if you take this longer 18-hour course. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to render the scene as is. This is a pretty simple 4-story house, and it is going to be rendering with some pretty decent radiance map and light cache settings, which is by far the most widely used combination for GI. What you'll see, even though this is pretty good settings, I'll show you the settings in a second, even though these are good GI settings, the image quality itself is pretty poor, and it's because of the image sampler. You could have the absolute best configuration of settings, GI, shadows, lights, color mapping, and everything else, but if your image sampling is not set correctly, you're going to lose everything. And not only that, it is probably the most important area because it is the biggest, has the biggest contribution to time in a rendering when you factor in what you put in and what you get out. So if you don't handle image sampling correctly, you're going to be suffering. Hopefully, if you're an advanced level user or intermediate level user, you've you've learned that adaptive subdivision is probably not the image sampler to use for production renderings. This is a production rendering, but I'm using the adaptive subdivision image sampler. The adaptive subdivision image sampler is great for test renderings and great in the configuration you see here. When I do a test render, I always use adaptive subdivision with the default test render settings. Before I go any farther, I want to show you an image. And I'm having to move behind the scenes in several different windows because it's such a it's a different machine. I'm not entirely used to it. Here is a box with a drastic aliased edge to it, and that edge has a aliased edge because there are only so many pixels that can be displayed on a screen, and so V-Ray has to accommodate this jagged aliased look by using a process called image sampling. Now, if you use just one subdivision for, say, the fixed image sampler, you're going to get one sample at the center of each pixel. You can't subdivide, or you can't color a pixel smaller than the entire pixel. You can't color part of a pixel one color and part of another pixel another color. You cannot do that. All you can do is subdivide. This dashed line represents the edge of that box, and all V-Ray knows is at the center of each pixel, what does it see? Well, at the center of this pixel, it sees the green box. At the center of this pixel, it sees the white background. So for this pixel, it shades the entire pixel green. This pixel, it shades the entire pixel white. Well, that's what you would get if you use one subdivision. You would get a very jagged, aliased look to your entire scene. If I set my image sampler to fixed and used one subdivision, I would get a very jagged, fairly ugly looking scene, no matter how good my GI and the rest of my settings are in V-Ray. If I go up to two subdivisions, I am subdividing each pixel twice, which gives me 4 subpixel samples. And so there is a sample taken at the center of each subpixel sample. So in the case of this pixel, you have 3 out of the 4 pixels detecting the green box, 1 detecting the white background. So what does it do? It can't, like I said, it cannot shade pixel in this fashion that you see here. The only thing it can do is recolor the pixels a certain amount to give it a more gradual change, a gradient at the edge. And that color that you see here is 75%, roughly 75% of the color, the original color of the original green box. The pixel to the right of it only detects the green box in 1 of the 4 subpixel samples. So only 25% of these subpixel samples are detecting the green box, and the result is 25% color of the original solid green that you see down here. In the next image, you see 3 subdivisions, which yields 9 subpixel samples. And you have 6 subpixel samples here detecting the green box, 3 detecting the white background, and as a result, 66% colorization. So all this subdivision is doing behind the scenes, regardless of whether it's fixed adaptive subdivision or adaptive DMC, is to arrive at the best possible pixel color for any given pixel. And if you ever wonder why movies like special effects in movies, or movies like Shrek, which are fully animated, or other full animation movies, have such beautiful, crisp, artifact-free video, it's because not necessarily because of the image sampling, but because of the higher resolution that they will render with, which when converted down to a DVD or even high definition will yield the same result as image sampling. Most movies are shot now in 4K Academy, which is 4096 pixels by 2048 pixels. And so when you render an image that large, you're going to get very good image sampling when you end up converting it down to a smaller image. So that is what image sampling is all about. Going back to the different image sampler types that you have here, you have adaptive subdivision, which should really, in my opinion, only be used for test renders for several reasons, not the least of which that it is not designed to render glossy reflections and glossy refractions very well. For that alone, you probably want to stay away from it. It is the only one that allows you to go less than 1 pixel per, or 1 sample per pixel. So instead of doing 1 sample per pixel, it will group a set of 4 pixels and take 1 sample at the center of each pixel. That is when you have a -1 value. If you have a -2 value, it will group 9 pixels together and take one sample at the center of the 9 pixels, which would be right here. But if you're going to be going down, if you're not going to be using a negative value, in other words, if you place this min and max rate at 0, which is the same as the fixed image sampler with one subdivision, this would give you the exact same result as the fixed image sampler with one subdivision. If you were doing anything less than a negative value here, you negate the whole purpose of using the adaptive subdivision image sampler, because it's the only one that goes less than one sample per pixel. So the moral of the story is use it for test renders, do not use it for production renders. So I'm going to leave this at 1 and 2. Quick note about the adaptive DMC. Adaptive DMC is the most widely used image sampler for production, and there's a reason. It's adaptive. Anytime you see the word adaptive in V-Ray, it means intuitive or smart, and it simply means it is going to try to take shortcuts. All V-Ray, or pretty much any other render engine or any other program that you're probably working with, is a series of algorithms running behind the scenes. And the way V-Ray renders so fast, or one of the ways it renders so fast, is because it is an adaptive renderer. It provides adaptive solutions throughout the entire program. Unlike other render engines, which are more strictly brute force, and they don't give you the chance to use adaptive settings. The adaptive nature of these settings simply means it truncates the algorithms at a certain point. So if you wanted to calculate pi to infinity, for example, or if you wanted to calculate pi, you wouldn't want to try to calculate it to infinity. If I was trying to tell you what pi is, I would simply say 3.14, or you could carry out a few more decimals and say 3.1456. And all these different settings that run behind the scenes, all they do is truncate the algorithms that are running behind the scenes so that you don't calculate all these settings to their maximum quality value. And it's also important at this point to mention, if you don't remember anything else, especially if you're a beginner user, if you don't remember anything else, there's 3 types of settings in V-Ray, or any other render engine for that matter. There are quality settings, which you see right here with minimum and maximum subdivisions. There are appearance settings, which you would see with something like color mapping, and then there are tool settings like the one you see right here, show samples. Quality settings control 2 things, and really 2 things only. They control noise and detail. If you are using an appearance setting, like you see here with color mapping, you are controlling composition, you're controlling color, brightness, exposure, things like that. And then, of course, tools like show samples have nothing to do with quality. They have nothing to do with appearance. It's just a tool setting. It's very important that for any setting in V-Ray, you at least know that. You at least know, is this a quality setting? Is it an appearance setting? Or is it a tool? And if it's a quality setting, as I said, it controls noise and detail. And if you knowing V-Ray means knowing how to troubleshoot. And if you know how to troubleshoot, you can figure out what your problem is and how to fix it. Anytime you have a rendering that is not exactly 100% exactly like you want it, it is a problem that you have to troubleshoot. And if you know how to troubleshoot, if you know the settings and what's running behind them, then you will know how to best manage those problems. And you also get the best speed versus quality. So inside the adaptive DMC image sampler, you have a minimum and maximum subdivision value. I always start with 2 for a minimum subdivision value for production renders. And that guarantees me that no matter what, every pixel in this image is going to be rendered with 2 subdivisions. It will be rendered up to 5 subdivisions dependent on this color threshold value. By default, you have the use DMC sampler threshold enabled for any scene that you open with V-Ray, or any time you initiate V-Ray, but you should never, in my opinion, you should never leave this enabled, because image sampling is too important. It should be disassociated with the noise threshold value that it's tied to with this use DMC sampler threshold. This noise threshold, as I'll discuss in a moment, is the most important setting in V-Ray. and I'll explain why in a minute, but it is tied initially to the DMC image sampler unless you disassociate it with this option here. So now I've got a color threshold that is dictating how adaptive to make this image sampler. And there's a very easy way to understand how this color threshold value ties into minimum and maximum subdivisions. I'm going to open up a color selector inside the environment color environment rollout, and it has nothing to do with this environment rollout has nothing to do with the DMC image sampler, but I'm using this as a way to demonstrate something. A pure white pixel is going to be made up of, all pixels are going to be made up of a red, green, and blue value, but a pure white pixel will have a color intensity value of 765, which is basically 255 times 3. So pure white is 765, pure black is 0. Now, what this color threshold here is saying is it's a value between 0 and 100%. When it's set to 1.0, even though it can go higher, it's really 100% when it's set to 1. If I set this value to the default 0.01, that is basically saying that any two pixels that are next to each other have to be within 1% color, and if they are not, they're going to be resampled. So the first, a pixel will get sampled at 2 subdivisions, so it will be divided 4 times, or it will be divided into 4 subpixel samples. If it doesn't meet that color threshold with all the adjacent pixels, those pixels will be divided again, and they will be divided with 3 subdivisions, which will yield 9 subpixel samples, and then 4, which will yield 16, and 5, which yields 25. And as you can see, it can quickly lead to some long render times. So if I have a value of 0.01 here, that's saying that I have to have 2 pixels no more than basically 7 integers, or a value of 7 apart from each other. So if I were to just go down to 247, which is just outside 1% of the total value of 765 here, even though the 2 colors may look similar, they are not similar enough to meet the color threshold value, and then the pixels will get resampled. So this value is so important to work with these 2 values here. You shouldn't set this value arbitrarily high. You shouldn't just set it to 100 or even anything close to it. You shouldn't even set it to 10. My suggestion is use a value of 5 and set the color threshold to 0.005, because that gives a good balance between 2 and 5. You could set this right now. I could set this to 100, and it's not going to make a lick of difference. It will not change the image one bit, because this color threshold is not low enough. If I were to drop this color threshold to 0 and say I want all pixels to be the exact same color, and if they're not, the only thing it can do is subdivide 100 times, whatever the maximum subdivision value is, which would be a complete waste of time, because the human eye would not see anything even close to that value. In most cases, you're not going to see anything above a 6. In animations, when you can see more artifacts because of the movement of an image, that might not be the case. You might want to go up a little bit higher to 8. But for the most part, 6 will do it. So I always set this to 2 and 5.005 to start with, and if I have to go up a little higher, I will. But I will only go up higher if I know that the image sampler is the weakest link. There's always a weakest link, and if the image sampler is not it, you shouldn't be adjusting it. Okay, so moving on to irradiance maps. Let's just actually really quick render this one time just to see what the difference in a good quality image sampler will make. And I render all of my scenes with the V-Ray frame buffer because of several reasons. One is this nice track mouse while rendering feature, which I'm sure you know about, which allows me to render the buckets that I want to, or wherever my mouse is, those are the buckets that are going to get rendered first. So that's one reason. There's many others, but that certainly is reason enough alone. As you can see, I get nice crisp edges, and I start to see a lot of detail that I would have lost before. All these little reveal features in the concrete start to show up, the texture of the concrete start to show up, and things in general start to look much better. There's still many things that can be done to improve this image. We don't have time to discuss all the reasons, but certainly image sampling is the most important area in V-Ray. So let's move on to irradiance maps. Okay, irradiance maps. The second most important area, in my opinion, in V-Ray. What is irradiance maps all about? I assume you know, if you're an advanced user, pretty much what's going on. I will give a very brief overview. If I was to set my current preset to custom, which would be the only thing that allows me to change this min and max rate or these other threshold values that you see here. If I set min and max rate to 0, that means my irradiance map is going to match exactly the output of what you see here, the output size. So my output, my render window size, will be 800 by 750. And when I use 0, 0, my irradiance map will be 800 by 750. Just like it says, it's a map. It's an irradiance map, so it's a map, and it has a resolution. When you go down from 0 to -1, -1, you're dropping that resolution in half. So now, instead of having an irradiance map of 800 by 750, it is going to be 400 by whatever half of 750 is. If I drop down again to -2, -2, it will cut it in half again to 200 by whatever, and so on. I would never want to have these two values the same. Just like I wouldn't want to have the adaptive DMC image sampler using the same minimum and maximum values. There's no reason to do that. If I were to do that, it would no longer be an adaptive solution. But it is an adaptive solution, which makes it very fast, or capable of being very fast if it's used properly. If I were to set this to very low, I would have 2 prepasses. I'm going to render this as is. You would see 2 prepasses, and it renders very quickly because it's such a fast machine. But if you notice, there was a quick message that said 2 prepasses. And those 2 prepasses represent the min and max rate. The first prepass is done at -4, second prepass is done at -3. And after the first pass is done at -4, the irradiance map will look at this color, normal, and distance threshold and try to determine if the color of 2 samples that are, or not, I shouldn't say 2 samples, the color of however many samples you see here, this value here, calculation pass interpolation samples, whatever this value is here, this will look at this many samples, 15, and decide if those 15 samples lie within a certain distance of each other. And it would be too complicated to say, to try to quantify what these values mean, because it's a very complex thing going on behind the scenes. But it is a certain distance, color, or normal threshold that is trying to be met by this first pass. If it does not meet that first pass, the samples will, the area in question will be sampled again, and they will be sampled up to the maximum value. And there are 3 main components to the irradiance map that really dictate the quality of the irradiance map. The minimum and maximum rate, which dictate the resolution, the hemispheric subdivisions, which controls the quality of the samples, and the interpolation samples, which controls the blending of the samples. I want to very quickly show you this image here. This is a geosphere that I created, and I just used the geosphere because it enabled me to scatter an arrow very quickly to simulate what happens at the center of each sample. So this virtual hemisphere is sitting on top of a sample that's taken with the irradiance map. And each one of these arrows detect different things. One might detect the blue sky, one might detect the green grass or the brown wall, and the total solution of all these arrows added up gives you one color, and that one color is used to dictate or to sample or to approximate what is going on in terms of GI at that very specific point. And if you want to be precise, this is really what the hemispheric subdivision looks like. In top view, this is what a hemisphere subdivided would look like. Every time you double this value, you're quadrupling the number of samples being used. So here I would have 2 subdivisions. I actually have 1 subdivision with 2 samples. If I go up to 2, I have 4 samples, and so on. This value here should be used sparingly. I always start with 20, And I always start with 20 because it has such an important impact on the render time, or at least the render time for the irradiance map. You should not arbitrarily set this thing too large. I always start with 20 and go up to a maximum of 50, and that will give me plenty decent quality. If it doesn't give me the quality I need, it's probably not the hemispheric subdivision that's in question. It's probably something else like the resolution or something else that has nothing to even do with the irradiance map. There are, I mentioned earlier that there are two things that all quality settings control. One is noise and one is detail. There are two types of noise. You should remember this, there are two types of noise in any image that you look at. There is fine granular noise and there's large splotchy noise. Large splotchy noise would be the kind that you see that takes up, there's not too much noise in this image, but large splotchy noise would cover a fairly large area. Fine granular noise is at the pixel level where you see almost a white type of noise. Fine granular noise is completely different than large splotchy noise. Anytime you see large splotchy noise, it's almost always going to be because of the irradiance map. If you see fine granular noise, it's almost always going to be because of the image sampler, unless you're using brute force, because the brute force has the tendency to give you very fine granular noise. So you can troubleshoot very quickly if you know that, and you can figure out, oh, large splotchy noise, that's probably because of the irradiance map. So we have several different presets. I'm going to always use very low for test renders because if I'm not doing a production render, I'm trying to get the fastest speed versus quality, and I'm going to use very low because it is a very good preset. With all the other items that ghost out, you don't control these unless you use the custom value. Very low gives me a great configuration for test renders. If I do a production render, I will try to use medium, and if that doesn't give me the detail I need, then I will try to go up to high. It's very important to note that the higher you go in your presets, when you go from, say, very low to medium or from medium to high, you're actually going to increase the noise in your image. It may sound strange, but you're actually going to increase the noise because it's like taking a large image, scaling it down, and seeing all that noise in a smaller area. So it's more dense, it's more apparent, it's easier to see. The opposite would be if you took a small image and stretched it very large. You would see just the opposite effect. You would see it very blurred. I could set this minimum and maximum rate so low that my quality would be so poor, it would look like there's absolutely no detail at all, but I would have no noise. So I have no noise, but I have no detail. So it's an offset of each other. So anytime you deal with a quality setting, it controls noise and detail, and you can't have the best of both worlds without a little bit of work. You have to offset one with the other. Okay, so very low for test renders, medium for production renders, possibly up to high for production renders. If I switch to high, I give myself the opportunity to see some of these details that I'm missing. Right now, I have no possible way to see these thin little grout lines that are not showing up because I've not taken enough samples. The samples just don't fall in those grout lines. So I have no opportunity to see most of these grout lines that are missing. I have to take more samples, and the min and max rate controls the number of samples. I want to show you one image here that sort of sums up what the irradiance map, the important irradiance map settings are all about. This states that both images were rendered with an irradiance map using a high preset. If a medium preset were used on the larger image here, then the grout lines that you see right here would only show up as well as they do in the smaller image. So here's the smaller 512 image, here's a larger 1024 image. Again, if I used a medium, both images were rendered with a high preset, but if I used a medium preset on this image, then the irradiance map with a medium here would be the same size as the irradiance map here set to high. Because remember, when I go from high, I have a max rate of 0. When I go from high to medium, I drop down one value in my max rate, which cuts my irradiance map resolution in half. And when I cut my irradiance map resolution in half, the result is I'm using half, I'm not having enough samples. I'm not taking as many samples. So one last time, if a median preset were used on this image, it would be the same in terms of the irradiance map, would be the same as using an irradiance map with a high preset here. So the detail that I see here, the nice, sharp, fairly sharp grout lines that I see here, or I should say the grout lines that I see here, which do not show up as well here, would be what I see here if I used a median preset here instead of a high. So if you understand that, then you know the importance of the resolution for the irradiance map. Let's move on to the light cache. Let's open up a different scene. Let's go back to this image here. And let's set both the primary and secondary bounce to light cache. Not something I would ever do unless I'm using progressive path tracing, which I'll discuss in a few minutes, but it helps me demonstrate what I'm trying to show here. And I'm going to do something else that I would never do in a production render or even a test render. I'm going to set my number of passes to 1. This number of passes represents the largest number of processors I have on any machine. So if I had another machine hooked up to this Go box and that machine had 16 processors, then I would type in 16 here. I only have 12 in this Go box, so I could literally type in 12 here and it wouldn't make any difference. Likewise, it wouldn't make any difference if I typed in 100 because it only needs whatever the maximum number of processors used by one computer. And the light cache is only going to be computed by one computer because you can't have multiple computers really processing a light cache, and there's a lot of complex reasons behind that. But needless to say, I have a 12-core machine, so I'm going to use that. I also want to take off interpolation by turning the filter to none, and I want to set my subdivision value really low to 100, and I want to go ahead and render this as is. And I actually have to turn the number of passes to 1 just so that there's no artificial blending of samples taken by the different processors. So I'm going to render as is right now, and the result is this very ugly Atari looking type of image. And all it's showing me is that there are the scene is divided into all these different sample cells, and this subdivision value, like any subdivision value in V-Ray, represents the square of the number of samples that are being taken. So if I have 100 subdivisions and I multiply 100 by 100, that's 10,000. So I have literally 10,000 of these little samples, sample cells in this image. And if I typed in 1,000, I would have 1 million samples. And if the subdivision represents the square of the number of rays shot, it only makes sense that every time you double that subdivision value, you're quadrupling the render time for the light cache. So again, use these values sparingly because they shouldn't be arbitrarily set too high because they can induce some really long render times. When I have a subdivision value of 100, I don't necessarily get this sample size set to 0.02. I will only get this sample size achieved if I have enough subdivisions to divide the scene evenly enough to make the size of these sample cells small enough. Right now I have 10,000 rays being shot, but if I increase this to something like 500 and render it again, I will see probably some smaller sample cells, and of course it induces a lot longer render time. I would see some smaller sample cells if I have reached that, unless I have reached that sample size, which I apparently have. What I'm seeing here is not smaller sample size, but rather a bombardment of those cells that are already at that 2% of my screen size. This sample size represents 2% of the screen size, and it's screen because it's set to screen here as opposed to world, which you would use for animations, most animations. But it can't divide these cells any smaller than 2% of my screen size. So all it can do is bombard them with extra information, which is why I see better, higher quality sample cells. I see samples that are closer in color. Now, I would never want to render with no interpolation because interpolation is necessary to prevent having to take more samples, because it allows me to blend the samples together and reduce the noise appropriately. And I certainly wouldn't want to use one pass because I'm literally going to render the light cache 1/12 of the speed as I would render when I use a number of passes set to 12. When I render again, I see a much faster light cache, and I will see the light cache samples rendered a little bit closer together. I want to show you really quickly what the effect of a light cache can do, what effect a light cache has on a scene. And in this particular scene, I want to render, actually it's not the right one, I want to go to this scene, and in this scene, I want to set my radiance map to high. I want to set my light cache to, believe it or not, I want to set it very low to 1. And I want to make sure my image sampling is set to something production value, which it is now. And I'll set this to 0.005. So I have decent production settings for the radiance map and light cache, for the radiance map and image sampling, which are the two most important areas. But if I don't have a decent light cache, if I actually have only one light cache sample being taken, then I'm going to see this. I'm going to see a black image because that one light cache sample is being used to approximate the GI in all of the secondary bounce surfaces, which, as you hopefully know, are the surfaces you don't see with the camera. That's what I get if I used a value of 1. If I jump this up even to a value of 10, which gives me 100 rays, then I would see a completely different colorization. But I would still see a lot of artifacts. I would still see where these grout lines are, a lot of brightly lit areas that shouldn't be there. I will see a lot of detail in this image brought out by the radiance map and brought out by the image sampler, but they are clouded or hindered by this light cache. And you start to see a different type of noise with the light cache than you see with the radiance map. So if I just improve the light cache, I could get rid of this strange artifact type of lighting that I see right there. I'm going to set this to 1,000, which gives me 1 million rays, and I should start to see in this area where the grout lines were before, I should start to see a lot better illumination of those grout lines, and they should look proper with a nice dark line to them. One other thing while this is rendering, adaptive tracing, if you've ever wondered what that is simply almost like the subdivision of a radiance map sample. It's taking a hemisphere, placing it on top of a sample, and dividing that sample into different quadrants to try to figure out what direction a sample is coming from, and it's just used to better color the sample, that sample cell area that the light cache sample is being used to approximate. It's, in most cases, it doesn't give you any improvement, any noticeable improvement in quality. If it did, you'd have to pretty much have every other setting in V-Ray set just right, and that's one of the lesser things you should be worried about. I just want to mention it because so many students tend to ask about that because they think, oh, adaptive, why aren't we using adaptive? Because it should be faster. No, it's not faster, it's actually slower. But now you see with the better subdivisions, I start to see this quality in the illumination of these grout lines. Always, always, always use the light cache for glossy rays option. It will give you incredible improvement in render times for no loss or no discernible loss of quality. And it's really helpful for glossy reflections, glossy refractions that take up a large portion of your image. So if I had a floor with, let's say, a 90% gloss or 10% blur, and that floor took up half my image, I could reduce my render times by something on the order of 20–30% just by enabling that one option there, because it borrows light cache sample information and uses it to speed up the process of blurry reflections, blurry refractions. Let's go to a different image and talk about brute force really quick. And I'm going to open up this image called chair. If I render this right now with the light cache and a radiance map configuration, you can see it renders very quickly, which is why so many people like the light cache in the radiance map configuration, and it is certainly good for many reasons. But one of the reasons that a lot of people don't like it in some cases is the lack of detail that you see, for example, around the bottom of the chairs. You don't see the shadows that you would expect to see in the real world because there's just not enough sampling here. And you could certainly improve this by having a better irradiance map and light cache. And just to show you what I was talking about before, I'm going to use a higher irradiance map and show that you will actually have more noise when you do. And I want to turn off show calc phase so you can see this better. If I render this again with the high, you'll see more noise appear, even though it is a higher quality image. You see a lot more splotches, and it's just because you're feeding more information to the same area and the noise becomes more apparent. It's not as blurred out as much, but you start to see this definition appear. You also have, before I move to brute force, you also have the option in here for ambient occlusion. If you use ambient occlusion, you'll start to see, if you know what ambient occlusion is, you'll know what I mean when I say it will give you a lot more definition around areas where different surfaces interact. And you can play around with this if you want, but this will give you a lot more definition in shadows and areas that need a little bit more detail. So instead of maybe going to a high preset for the irradiance map, you could settle for a medium preset and just put a little ambient occlusion in. Just be aware that the ambient occlusion that you put into this cannot be removed once it's in there, which is why I don't like using this ambient occlusion here. I would rather use it under a render element option, which I'll show you in a few minutes. But going to brute force, this is a very, it should be a very simple type of GI to use because there's really only two settings that you need to worry about, subdivision and the noise threshold. But it's misunderstood by a lot of people because they don't understand the impact of the DMC sampler that's working behind the scenes. If I render this right now with the default brute force options and the default DMC sampler options, you will see not only a slower rendering, but you will see a lot more noise. But it doesn't mean that it's a less accurate image. It's by far a more accurate image. It just has samples taken in a different way and GI approximated in a different way. When you render a light cache and irradiance map, it calculates the irradiance map and light cache for the entire image basically all at once, or at least computes it or combines it all together to give you one irradiance map or one light cache setup. But when you render with brute force, you're basically doing a bunch of small little renderings. These buckets are 64 by 64, and using brute force is like doing a bunch of small 64 by 64 pixel renderings at the same time if you have multiple cores like this. But it's like doing a bunch of small renderings. And because of that, it uses a lot less RAM, which is one benefit. And there are many benefits of brute force. I don't even have time to go over all of them. But the one downside to it is that it's slow and gives you a lot of noise in return. So how do you compensate for that, or what do you do to control this noise? Well, I'm going to stop this, but it takes a second to purge all this going on behind the scenes. If I want to reduce this noise, I have to increase this subdivision value, but I can't just increase the subdivision value. I could set this to something like 20 and expect to see an improvement in the noise. Actually, I'll set this to 30, and I'll certainly see less noise, but that's not going to be enough. And it's not going to be enough because just like most subdivision values in V-Ray, this subdivision value is tied to the noise threshold. The noise threshold I told you earlier was the most important area, most important setting in V-Ray, and the reason why is because it controls all blurry effects. GI is a blurry effect, motion blur is a blurry effect, depth of field, all these things are blurry effects. And even image sampler, as I said, is tied to this value unless you tell it otherwise. But it's so important because it will not allow the subdivisions to even take all those samples if this value isn't set properly. So right now, even though I set the subdivision value to 30, it's not going to do all the samples it wants to do because this noise threshold doesn't allow it. It's sort of like a mother and child relationship where the mother is the noise threshold and the child is the subdivision value. If the child says, I'm willing to clean my room and I'll spend 30 minutes doing it, but the mother says, you don't need to do that, you don't need to clean it that much, then it's not going to be clean. Likewise, if the mother says, I want a perfectly clean room, which means I want no noise at all, so I drop this to 0. If the mother says I want a perfectly clean room, it's still not going to be clean if the subdivision value is too low. So both of these values feed off of each other, and you can't remove noise without setting both properly. You can't set one low and the other high, or vice versa. It's also important to, I'm just going to go ahead and render this as is, just to show you what I'm talking about. I'm using a noise value of 0, which you would think would give you a noiseless image, but it's not, because I'm using a subdivision of 1. So it's still going to be very noisy. In fact, it's probably going to be noisier than this. Yep, there it is. So it's a very noisy image. And likewise, I cannot set the subdivision value to something like 100, which is a very high value, and expect to see good quality when I set the noise threshold too high. But there's one more setting in the DMC sampler that you have to constantly keep your eye on, and that is the adaptive amount. And I'm trying to stop this rendering, but it's like a runaway train. So the adaptive amount is very important because it controls how much the noise threshold is actually looked at. If I set the adaptive amount to 1.0, which is its default value, that's basically saying whatever this noise threshold is, consider it 100%. When it's set to 0, it basically says ignore the noise threshold. Noise threshold doesn't mean anything if you have the adaptive amount set to 0. There's no reason to set the adaptive amount to 0, because any blurry effect in V-Ray that has adaptive nature to it, any area in V-Ray that uses adaptiveness to increase the speed, is no longer adaptive. And that would not be a good thing. So you would think, well, let's just set this to 1.0 all the time. Well, the default value is 0.85, and the reason why is because the Chaos guys wanted to ensure that when new users or beginner users rendered with V-Ray, they wanted to ensure a certain level of quality to their images. And setting this arbitrarily to 1.0 didn't necessarily give that for all the different types of configurations. So there are some areas, there are some uses or some configurations of your scenes, some settings and features that you could use with this adaptive amount set to 1.0 that could induce some noise. I would still always set it to 1.0 and attack the noise or attack the problems when the problems arise. I always set my settings to the lowest possible value and then deal with the problems one at a time. So if I have noise and I know anything about the GI and the image sampler and all these other things, then I'll know what setting is the weakest link and I'll know how to fix it. So I always set this at 1.0 and I leave this at 0.01 unless there is a problem that has to be fixed. I had asked the guys at Chaos just today to verify something, and I had asked them, why do you not have an option to disassociate all the different areas that you look towards the noise threshold like you do with the image sampler? And their answer was because the image sampler is so important, and they didn't want to have a bunch of options in V-Ray like this, where it says use DMC sampler threshold. They didn't want a bunch of options throughout all the different features that use or look to this noise threshold to complicate things. It's, V-Ray is, any render engine is complicated enough, and there's plenty of settings as is. So that is why there are so many settings still tied to this noise threshold value. So the point is, if you have a problem, try to fix the problem where the problem lies, and only change this noise threshold value if there's no other option. So as an example, if you have noise in your shadows of your lights and you set the subdivision value of the shadows to say 20 or 30, which would normally remove the noise, if it doesn't remove the noise, then it's probably because of this noise threshold, and then and only then should you reduce the noise threshold value to something like 0.005. But just like the color threshold I was talking about before, this value can actually be quantified as a percentage of the pixel colors that you see that is being sampled, and all it says in this case is every pixel, or I should say samples, the samples have to be within 0.5% of each other, otherwise they will not meet the noise threshold and they will the setting that uses subdivision value will achieve a higher set of samples. It will try to go after a higher number of subdivisions. Okay, let's look briefly at progressive path tracing. That's a very cool feature that not too many people use, unfortunately. And I'm going to go back to this image right here, or the scene right here. So progressive path tracing, a very, very cool feature for one very specific reason, because it gives you the opportunity to see what your image could look like with perfect settings. Now, perfect settings really aren't even possible. You can't calculate pi to infinity, but if you had all the time in the world and wanted to see what your scene would look like with the best possible settings, and you even knew what all the settings meant, you could go through and set your noise threshold to 0, or you could set adaptive amount to 0, which would remove all adaptiveness in any feature that has it. You could go through here and you could use a high preset for a radiance map. You could use 1,000 or even higher for the light cache. You could do all this stuff, but if it still doesn't yield the results you want, then you have the option to use progressive path tracing. And just to show you what it can do, I'm going to set this noise threshold value very high. I'm basically going to ruin this scene with very, very poor settings. I'm going to use ridiculously low settings for the min and max rate for the radiance map. I'm going to use a value of, well, light cache I'm going to touch in a minute. I'm going to use very low values for my image sampler. I'll set this to -3, -3, and there's a lot of other things I could do to mess this scene up. But the beauty of the progressive path tracing is there's only two things that you have to use or have to know. One is that you can't have anti-aliasing turned on, so you have to disable the filter. And the other thing is that the only setting that you need to worry about or control is the subdivision value for light cache. But to use it properly, you have to set both primary and secondary to light cache. Once I do that, I have to set my mode, of course, to progressive path tracing. And this subdivision value is the only thing that will control the quality of the progressive path tracing. So let's see it in action. If I were to render right now with one subdivision, or I'm sorry, with 1,000 subdivisions, I'm basically going to take 1,000,000 samples and use that throughout my entire image, and I would get what you see here, which is certainly not a good-looking image. This is at 50%, but if I zoomed in, you would see it's still a very noisy image. But if I let this sit long enough, if I let it render long enough, this would eventually be a noiseless image. In other words, if I set this to, say, the highest possible value, 65,000, I would eventually get a noiseless image. But it would induce some long render time, so this is certainly not something you want to use on a regular basis to do a rendering. You certainly could. I could let this rendering go overnight, and it would take 7 hours to render, but it would probably be a noiseless image when I'm done. However, I don't want to do that in this case. I want to instead use a little trick where if I'm trying to see if I'm trying to figure out if I can remove noise or get the detail I need in a certain area, I can use this option to render a specific smaller area like this, and all those light cache samples will be compressed into a smaller area, and the end result will be it will clean up this area much faster. So the whole point of using this is to see what my image could look like with the best possible configuration, and it makes it easy because the only thing you have to worry about is turning off anti-aliasing and using the subdivision value properly. Now, what subdivision value do you use? Well, generally you can summarize it in this fashion. Each pixel on your image needs 1,000 rays, and if you know what the number of pixels you have in your image, which is just a matter of multiplying the width by the height, if you know what the number of pixels you have, let's just say I have 1,000 by 1,000. If I had a 1,000 by 1,000 pixel image, I have 1,000,000 pixels. And if I need 1,000 rays per pixel, then I know I need 1,000,000,000 pixels. So if I open up calculator and I was to take 100, this is I don't want to get lost here. That's 1,000, 1, 2, 3 is a million, 1, 2, 3 is a billion. Take the square of that. I need 31,622 samples inside my subdivision rollout. I can just say 32,000. I need 32,000 subdivisions to give me enough rays to get 1,000 rays per pixel for this entire image. That's, of course, if I render the entire image, if I render on view. So if I hit the render button now, I will know that after 3 hours, 20 minutes, and it's usually very accurate in its approximation, I will know after 3 hours, 21 minutes, I will have a noiseless image. It takes 1,000 rays per pixel to give you that noiseless image. And if I don't want to wait that long for the entire image, again, I can stop it and do a smaller area to see what this image will look like with perfect render settings. So it's sort of a tool to give you that kind of capability. Let's look at the raycaster parameters really quick. And I only have 5 minutes left for this, but I think I'm going to go over 10 minutes. So I'm going to spend 15 more minutes discussing the different features that I wanted to cover. So let's quickly move over to the raycaster settings inside the system rollout. The raycaster settings may look a little confusing, but it's really not if you consider just a couple things. Anytime you hit the render button, a lot of things happen behind the scenes. One of the things that happens is this tree of information is being built, and this tree is comprised of a trunk, branches, and leaves. And the depth value here specifies how many branches deep this tree is going to be. You can sort of equate it to a system where I'm going to go on my server and look at all the different maps that I have. Here's just a directory that shows all the maps that sit on my computer, and it shows that I have a dirt folder, I have fabrics, I have fences, fire, all these different folders. If I were to set this max tree depth to 1, it would be like taking all of my images in all these folders and putting them into one folder, which would not be a good thing because it would make it very hard for Max to find the file that you're looking for. It would have to look through a lot of junk to find the file that it needs. Likewise, setting this to too high a value, like 100, in some cases might have the opposite effect, where it produces too many folders for too few a number of files. It's impossible to know what the perfect value is to use here, but if you have a long rendering, especially in animation, if you have a long rendering that's going to take several days to render, I highly suggest experimenting with this value. The default value is 80, but I would highly suggest experimenting, even if only for a small render region, what a value of 70 would do for you. And if the render speed increases, or if the render time decreases, then drop it down again to 60. If the render time decreases again, drop it down to 50. If it slows down and starts to take longer, then you know that a value somewhere between 50 and 60 is what you want to settle on, maybe 55. But there is a certain perfect number that will give you the best render time, and it would behoove you to spend a little time to figure out what that value is. Likewise, the excuse me, the dynamic memory limit controls how much RAM is set aside for dynamic objects in your scene. There are two types of geometry in your scene. You have static geometry and dynamic geometry. Static geometry is all loaded up into RAM all at once, and that could consume a lot of RAM, too much RAM in some cases, and that's one of the reasons why proxies were created to facilitate the rendering of very, very large scenes. With proxies, you can literally render billions and billions of polygons without having max crash, especially if you use a 64-bit operating system. But the dynamic memory limit, or the dynamic memory options that you see here, control how much RAM is set aside for those dynamic geometry. If I had too much set aside here, this machine has 12 gigabytes, so it's almost impossible to set it too high. But if I had a very large scene and set this really too high, something like, let's say, 6,000, if I have a 12 gig machine and set aside 6 gigs for my dynamic geometry, that might be a problem because I might have too little amount of memory set aside for static objects that you see right now in the scene. If I have this set too low, the default value is 400, but if I have it set to In some cases 400 is too low, but if I have it set to 200, 300, 400, it might have the opposite effect where too little is set aside for dynamic objects, and therefore too much time is spent transferring dynamic objects to and from RAM, from the RAM to the hard drive, back to RAM, back to hard drive. That's not a good thing, and you would see an indication of that if you saw your task manager and saw all the processors running at a fraction of their possible speed. If they're running at 10, 20%, then a good indication of what that sometimes means is that you've run out of RAM. And you can, of course, look at your RAM and see what that's set to. But point is, this value controls how much is set aside for dynamic objects. There are three types of geometry that will automatically be treated as dynamic geometry. Proxies, of course, V-ray fur, and V-ray displacement. A general rule that I follow is I add up all the proxy files in my scene, and let's just say I had 100 different cars, and each one of those cars was 10 megabytes. Well, I would need just 2 gigabytes straight off the top just for those 100 cars, because those files themselves combine to make 2 gigabytes. So I need 2 gigabytes set aside for those 100 cars. If I don't have that, I might run out of RAM for dynamic geometry and start inducing much longer render times. If you have a workstation that doesn't have that much RAM and you're constantly running into problems, you can just forget about this value entirely and set your entire scene to render dynamically by switching default geometry to dynamic. And that will prevent you from crashing in most cases, and that will help you render larger images. The downside is you will induce much longer render times because you spend so much time waiting for information to move back and forth from the hard drive to RAM. Or you could set it to auto, which is the default value, and let V-ray decide which objects to automatically turn into proxies, which are, of course, dynamic geometry. You let V-ray figure that out, and it simply takes the largest objects, polygon-wise, and converts them to proxies, and in many cases that's fine. But this dynamic memory limit combined with default geometry gives you a little bit more control of what exactly is dynamic. The other two options I don't recommend even worrying about. They don't give you the same bang for the buck that you get for these other two options I just discussed. All right, let's move to the V-ray frame buffer. I'm going to reopen a scene that we looked at a moment ago, chair, and the V-ray frame buffer. Actually, instead of this scene, let's open up another scene called stereo, Hampton Inn stereo. And I'm going to illustrate one of the new features that came out with Service Pack 5. It is the stereo camera. If you were to go to create helpers, V-ray, you would notice a new feature called V-ray stereoscopic. This is a new type of camera that is solely there to help you render stereoscopic images. So all you have to do is drop it in anywhere in your scene, doesn't matter where, drop it in, and the eye distance is basically the distance between the two virtual cameras that are created from the one camera that you render. Even though it's V-ray, even though it says it's a V-ray camera, it's not actually, there's no camera that you create that you render with. You're still rendering with the same old camera that you have set up. But once you drop this gizmo in here, you can turn your standard or V-ray camera into a stereoscopic camera with, or I should say, two separate cameras with two separate lenses that are set aside that are this far apart. You have three different focus methods. You have none, which is basically like saying take both cameras and set them parallel. You have rotation, which turns both cameras towards a focus point, the target distance that you have set with the target of the camera that you're rendering. And then you have shear, which probably isn't as necessary, and it induces some keystoning. Rotation is probably what you want in most cases. Regardless, I'm going to set it to rotation right now, and there's a few other settings that aren't as important. But if I were to render this right now, and I think I have some pretty quick default render settings, if I were to render this right now, you would see the V-ray frame buffer turned into twice its normal size, or at least it wants to be twice the size. And the reason why is because it's going to render two separate images of the same scene. One is going to be rendered and placed on the left side of the V-Ray frame buffer, and one is going to be placed on the right side of the frame buffer. And they look pretty similar, but they're actually slightly different. If you notice the spacing between the building and the edge of the right image, it's smaller than the space between this building's right edge and the edge of the image. And you notice the spacing difference right here versus the difference between the edge of the building and the edge of the image there. So it's basically just two cameras rendering the same thing at slightly offset positions and slightly tilted perspectives. And when you, at the bottom of the V-Ray frame buffer are these new options, stereo red cyan, which allows you to see the combination of both images using or as viewed through stereo red cyan glasses. So if you had the 3D glasses that were cyan and red colored, you would use this button here. If you had glasses that were green and magenta, you would use this button here. And if you use glasses, if you're wearing glasses right now, you would see this building sort of pop out. And the farther the eye separation is, the more that the objects would appear to be popping out. So I'm not the biggest fan of 3D, but it's coming around. It's certainly something that is worth playing around with. There's a certain coolness factor to it, and it is probably, I don't want to say probably, but it's possibly going to be much better in the future and something that everyone might consider using in the future. So V-Ray has incorporated it right now, and it's very simple and very easy to use. Another feature in the render scene dialog box that has been added with, I believe, Service Pack 4 is the option to render with under render elements the element called V-Ray extra textures. And this is a very cool little, I'm going to delete this render ID element. This V-Ray extra textures is basically a fast, easy, and effective way to create ambient occlusion. And it was previously a little more complicated, a little more time consuming to set up, but it's very quick and easy to use now. And I prefer this ambient occlusion over what you see here in the GI rollout, because once this is in here, it's in for good. I prefer to composite things like ambient occlusion in post-production tools like Photoshop or Fusion or some other compositing software. And all you have to do is go to the V-Ray Extra Textures Parameters Rollout, click on the None button under Texture, and select the V-Ray Dirt Map, which is the same thing you would have to do before, but you would have a lot more steps before you get to the V-Ray Dirt Map. So you load up the V-Ray Dirt Map, open up the material editor, bring the dirt map into the material editor, create an instance, just like you would do with the previous setup, and set your radius to, for this scene, something like 10 feet, which basically creates that dome that's sitting above each sample. It sets it at 10 feet. So anything within 10 feet of any surface, if any surface is blocked within 10 feet of that surface, it will be occluded and given a darker color closer towards the black spectrum that you see here. So with 10 set up, I get a nice ambient occlusion, and I get it inside the V-Ray frame buffer as a drop-down, which is another reason why I like to use the V-Ray frame buffer, because instead of seeing a separate image created, I see this V-Ray extra textures automatically created and accessed through this drop-down list. And I could improve the quality of what I see here through better image sampling, and I could reduce the noise through the subdivision value in the dirt map. But it is so important to use, in my opinion, it is so important to use ambient occlusion for all your projects, because it brings out detail so much better than the image sampler could ever bring out in your raw rendered image. If I use just even typical default production render settings, these grout lines that you see here would just pop out. And when you bring that image into Photoshop as a multiplied layer, if you plop it on top of your rendered image, set that layer to multiply, you can control the amount of ambient occlusion from 0 to 100% very easily, and those details will just pop out. And in most cases, I would prefer using ambient occlusion far better than using a higher radiance map preset or higher quality settings for the image sampler, because it doesn't take much more render time to create this this extra detail with the ambient occlusion. You get much better results using ambient occlusion, much better detail for the smaller increase in render time that you would get with higher render settings. Two more areas, I'm going to cover them real quick in the next 2 minutes. V-Ray raw images. If you are on a machine that does not have 12 gigabytes of RAM or 16 gigabytes of RAM or something like that, and you're trying to render a very large image like 10,000 by 10,000, and I'm going to just reset this scene to a blank scene, create a few different teapots, just because I don't need GI or anything else to demonstrate this. But if I'm trying to render a very large image, and I'll just set this to 5,000 so it doesn't take too long, 5,000 by 5,000, that's enough to crash some computers, even if it's just a small scene like this, because there's so much memory that has to be set aside in the buffer to compensate for this. So to get around that, one of the things you can do is you can enable render to V-Ray raw image file, turn on generate preview so that you can see a preview of this, and then turn off render to memory frame buffer. So when you render, you see a, what am I forgetting here? Oh, I have to save it to a file because I'm trying to save a file, so I have to create a file name and save it somewhere. Let's just call it sample. Render again. And you will see this large 5,000 by 5,000 pixel preview. I can't zoom in. I can't really do anything but just look at it as it is. But this doesn't consume the same amount of RAM that you would have with a real rendered image at 5,000 by 5,000. You use very, very little RAM to process this in terms of the image. But you will have an image sitting on the desktop, which I can open up. I can't show you my desktop because of the webinar that's running behind the scenes. But if I go to view, if I go to rendering, view image file, I can now load up that V-Ray image file that is sitting on my desktop right there. Notice the size of it, 573 megabytes. So that certainly would consume a lot of memory. But I can load that up just fine, and I can zoom in 8 times and see what this image looks like at 100%. So this would crash a lot of computers, and this V-Ray raw image files is a great way to get around that. Last thing I wanted to talk about was the anti-aliasing filters. All these filters that you see do one of two things. They either sharpen your image or they blur the image. And in some cases, you have to use something like a video filter or a soften filter if you're doing an animation. But in most cases, I personally like to try to use no filter at all, because anytime you use a filter, whether it's a Catmull ROM, soften video, you're going to induce longer render times. If you were to use a soften filter, you could have a 30-40% longer rendering, which when used on an animation, which is when you would use it, you would induce much, much longer render times. So use the filters wisely and don't overdo it with your blurring effects that you get with this. The more blurred your image, the longer it's going to take to render. I like to use Catmull ROM for images, for still images, because it sharpens it nicely, and I like to use no filter for animations because it's the fastest filter. There are 4 V-Ray filters, and these have varied sharpening and blurring effects. The V-Ray Lang sauce filter is probably the best one to use if you're going to use a filter. And the reason why is it can reduce moire effects, and those are effects that, like the type that you see on this image here. If I zoom in really close, you start to see the moire effect here, which gives you some distorted, strange looks to objects that have a lot of very tightly packed parallel surfaces. So this is a standing seam roof, and when viewed at a very low angle, it doesn't look like what it does here, which is parallel lines. It instead induces a moire effect. So the V-Ray Lang sauce filter can get around that and improve it and make your image overall much better. That does it. That's all I really wanted to talk about. Again, this has been a 1 hour and now 15-minute presentation on V-Ray Advanced. For more information about this class that we offer or any other class, you can visit the CGschool.com. We have a number of of offers, or I should say early bird specials for each one of these classes we do, and they are typically somewhere 30–40% off the default price. And so if you sign up early, you can get a much lower cost. We do online training, we do webinar training, we do in-person training, and so that is the CG School. That is the presentation on V-Ray Advanced. I thank you for joining the webinar, and have a great day.